Welcome, friends, to this presentation on Ochumaré's Rainbow and the River Maid, Queerness in Black Atlantic Religions, with this outstanding group of presenters, Khytie Brown, Ph.D., Elizabeth Pérez, Ph.D., and moderator Ahmad Greene-Hayes, Ph.D. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. We are pleased to have the opportunity this evening to host an intriguing conversation that will explore symbols and traditions in Black Atlantic religions, including Ochumaré, the rainbow serpent, that is associated with gender nonconforming and trans experience because it changes gender, sex depending on the time of the year. And the River Maid in Jamaican Revival Zion religion, an Afro-queer space in which fluidity of gender, sexuality, and non-normative intimacies is fostered through trans journeys and spirit possession. The moderator of tonight's conversation is Ahmad Greene-Hayes, an assistant professor of African American religious studies at Harvard Divinity School. A social historian and critical theorist, Greene-Hayes' research interests includes critical Black studies, Black Atlantic religions in the Americas, and race, queerness, and sexuality in the context of African American and Caribbean religious histories. He is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Underworld Work, Black Atlantic Religion Making in Jim Crow New Orleans. Ahmad is also a member of the advisory team for LGBTQ RAN. Our two presenters are, first, Khytie Brown, an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is an ethnographer and scholar of African diaspora religions and African African-American studies. Khytie holds a Ph.D. in African and African-American studies from Harvard University. She is currently working on her book manuscript titled Afro-Queer Journeys, Transnational Revival Zion Religion in Jamaica and Panama. The book will be the first of its kind that foregrounds revival Zion religion and addresses the interrelationship between Afrophobia and homophobia, sensory hierarchies of difference in the making of marginalized religions, and practitioners' subversive world-building responses through their somatic practice of journeying. Our second presenter is Elizabeth Pérez, an associate professor of religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is an ethnographer and historian of Africa diasporic traditions and LGBTQ religious experience, and earned her Ph.D. at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Her first monograph, Religion in the Kitchen, Cooking, Talking, and the Making of Black Atlantic Traditions, was awarded the 2017 Clifford Geertz Prize in the Anthropology of Religion by the Society for the Anthropology of Religion, and received honorable mention for the Caribbean Studies Association 2019 Barbara T. Christian Literary Award. Great program tonight. So to those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A function. The presenters will respond to those during the Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. If you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to any of the presenters, stay after the webinar is concluded and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Asati, who is the tech manager for this program. Now, I am pleased to welcome moderator Ahmad Greene-Hayes, along with Khytie Brown and Elizabeth Pérez, to begin this conversation on Ochumaré's rainbow and the River Maid, queerness in Black Atlantic religions.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that wonderful introduction. It is my pleasure to moderate this conversation between two scholars whom I respect and admire, and whose work is pushing the boundaries of what it means to study Black Atlantic religions in the contemporary period. Our conversation tonight emerges from a space of queer inquiry as we collectively seek to bring to the fore the marginalized experiences of Black practitioners of largely non-Christian religions, with an eye towards the journeys of queer, gender nonconforming, and transgender persons, spirits, deities at the helm of these vibrant and diverse religious communities. Our two experts will begin with brief introductory comments, and then we will engage in a conversation before opening the virtual floor for Q&A. I will now turn the floor over to Dr. Kaiti Brown, and then we will hear from Dr. Elizabeth Pérez. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. Thank you so much, Mark. I'm really excited to be here. I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. Believe that pulls itself up. Okay, great. And I'll just make this smaller so that, okay, perfect. So I wanted to begin my brief comments with a Jamaican folk tale about a mermaid spirit who inhabits the rivers and sometimes the seas of Jamaica. She's a primordial and archetypal spirit, affectionately and even dreadfully called River Muma, the River Maid, or sometimes just called the Maid. Legend says that River Muma inhabits the rivers of Jamaica and all the fish are River Muma's children. Sometimes people say River Muma rises out of the river to sit on the rocks and comb her long black hair. But like they say, don't touch River Muma. Don't even look at her. There's no telling what she will do if you try. Some say if you so much as see her, you'll fall into a trance and she'll grab you by the heels and drag you under the river. If you try to catch her, the fish will disappear, the rivers will run dry. It's best, they say, not to make trouble with River Muma. So what wisdom might we glean from the cautionary tale of a vengeful mermaid who resides in the rivers of Jamaica? So there's really a long answer to this that flows into the Atlantic Ocean, stretches beyond the Colunga Line, and into other worldly dimensions that holds histories of tortured crossings, the ill-begotten gains of colonialism and transatlantic slavery, revealing the energies of primordial spirits that journeyed alongside the captives to their unwelcoming new home. So River Muma is a riverine social theorist who can help us to understand the transoceanic circuits, transactions, and exchanges that form the geographic and conceptual space known as the Black Atlantic. However, the part of the story that I want us to focus our attention on is the line that says, River Muma inhabits the rivers of Jamaica and all the fish are River Muma's children. So who are the fish? Who are River Muma's children? And what does this riverine spirit have to do with queerness and Black Atlantic religions, right? So River Muma, or the Maid, is an essential avatar within Jamaican Revival Zion religion. And Revival Zion is a Congo heritage indigenous religion of Jamaica that interweaves Christianity with West and Central African religious practices. And Revival Zion is often contested because of the interpenetration of colonial legacies of Afrophobia and homophobia that render practitioners malignant queer sorcerers that are outside of the bounds of Anglo-Christianity. So while revivalists themselves self-identify as Christians, they also acknowledge a world of spirits and practices that are primarily African, but also multi-ethnic. Revivalists work with various spirits and messengers who belong to what are called nations. And practitioners access these nations through the embodied ritual of journeying, where they enter a trance state that can last for hours, days, or sometimes even months. And during these spiritual journeys, practitioners report traveling to other lands and spiritual cities where they fight spiritual battles, gain spiritual codes and keys before returning to this realm. And the most prominent nations are spiritual Africa, spiritual China, and spiritual India, and a geo-spiritual locale called the river. And so the river, or the river nation of revival, is where we meet upon River Muma and her children. So really, Revival Zion is divided into two different orders, the 60 and the 61 order. And I can go into a little bit more about that later on. But within the language of revival, there's this concept of being all nations, which is that you belong to the 60 order, which is the more Christian side, or the 61 order, that is the more African side of revival. And in revival, there's a concept called being all nations, right? Which means that you belong to both of these orders. Or there's also a concept that is called twofold. And so I argue that this concept of being twofold is foundational to creating alternative spaces within revival for various subjectivities, for various intimacies and ways of being that are malleable. And so I posit that in Revival Zion, this idea of being twofold really works very similarly to the Native American concept of being two-spirit, or the idea of having two-spirit people. That is, people who are neither male nor female, but are gender variant, and who through spiritual intervention fill special religious roles as healers, shamans, and ceremonial leaders. And through my research on Revival Zion, I see this resonance within revival as well, where the most gifted healers, leaders, readers are either all nations or twofold, and also exhibit forms of creative gender variation. And even River Muma herself is twofold, right? So she's half fish, half human, half ancestor, half primordial spirit, mostly female, but a lot of the time she's also non-binary, right? And so this ability for people to flow between the 60 and 61 orders illustrates the shifting orientations and characteristic fluidity of what I call the Afro-queer. And so I coined Afro-queer to discuss non-normative, multi-sensual, and multi-dimensional modes of being and doing in the world that are grounded in Africana spiritual and cultural traditions that allow for various subjectivities, various intimacies and relationships that are not only about sex and gender, but Africana personhood in its multiplicity, right? And ultimately, through the work that I've done, I realized that there is often a form of homosociality, particularly among men within Revival Zion rituals, particularly the river rituals, that stand in contradistinction to the typically hyper-police and mandatory forms of Jamaican hyper-masculinity, where forms of almost compulsory homophobia used to uphold Jamaican masculinity give way to more physical intimacy between men, playful teasing and touching, and the proliferation of double entendres that both soften and lend sensuality and ambiguity to ways of relating. And I just wanted to end some of my comments by saying that one of these double entendres is the use of the term fish among revivalists, right? So fish is normally a pejorative word in broader Jamaican society that refers to homosexual men. However, in the revival context, the fish reigns supreme. The fish is divine, literally, as those who belong to the river are duty bound to River Muma. So outside of every Revival Zion church, there's a pool or a body of water that is dedicated to the River Maid. And while the language of fish is used to refer to gay men in Jamaica, the etymology of it is unclear. My work provides some clues for tracing a discursive relationship between Afrophobic discourses that criminalize and ostracize Africana religious practices like revival and Christian-based homophobia. So for example, the early Christian theologian Tertullian, he writes about the Christian church's use of the fish symbol as a secret code and how early Christians, believers considered themselves little fishes. And so in his treatise on baptism, he says, "But we little fishes, after the example of our fish, Jesus Christ, are born in water, nor have we safety in any other way than by permanently abiding in water." So that most monstrous creature, who had no right to teach even sound doctrine, knew full well how to kill the little fishes by taking them away from the water, right? And so what does it mean for queer revivalists to permanently abide in water through transgressive geospiritual citizenship and belonging to the river nation within a context where it's blasphemous and often unsafe to be a little fish? How does Revival Zion River Nation stand against these monstrous creatures of homophobia and Afrophobia that know how to kill the little fishes? How do they sustain the actual and metaphoric waters wherein practitioners can dwell and flourish, right? And so within my larger work, I analyze Revival's adoption of the concept of the fish as a multiply layered African, Indian, African diasporic, and Christian symbol, where their baptism and being born and abiding in water as little fishes extends beyond Christian notions to this Afro-queer epistemic orientation within genealogies of African and African diasporic Mami waters, right? And so I'll end by finally saying that, you know, within Revival Zion, through the River Maid, through these practices of the River Nation that I'll say more about later, you know, there's often this discussion of the fact that these things, nation belonging, choose you. But there's also vernacular theorizing about gender and sexuality, where they argue that the River Maid chooses you. You don't get to choose, right? And then in that way, they're articulating this idea that gender and sexuality and the various fluidities in the River Nation are not these neoliberal Western impositions. They're not a result of a Faustian bargain gone wrong. They're not a result of sin, but they're actually gifted to people by ancestors, right? And revivals situate their practice and their attendant gender and sexual expressions within a genealogy of those who came before, against tropes of queer as a neoliberal Western imposition. And I look forward to talking a little bit more about it. And on the screen right there, there's one of the practitioners who's wearing a river gown, and on it he has both representations of male and female river maid or river mama spirits on it. And I'll end my comments there and look forward to turning it over to Ahmad again.
Thank you so much for that, Khytie. We'll now hear from Dr. Perez.
Thank you, Ahmad. Thank you, Khytie. That's really a difficult presentation to follow. But I wanted to thank first also Mark Bowman for inviting me on Asati, for making this possible technologically for us to be on Zoom today all together. I'm also going to share my screen for a moment. And I thought it would be maybe useful for folks who are joining a little bit later or are not familiar with sort of Afro-diasporic or Black Atlantic religions to just give an overview of what is meant by that terminology. And largely it's sort of contemporary use derives from the work of Paul Gilroy on the Black Atlantic and Black historical consciousness in this cultural space and historical moment where the transatlantic slave trade really gets going, maybe more 1715, or they got 1515 to about 1870, which seems really late for those of us who are you know, born in the US, but the transatlantic slave trade goes on. Abolition does not occur until much later in Cuba and Brazil, for example. And so this is often a map that I show to try to start delineating the different ethnic groups, the West and Central African groups that contributed to the formation of what we call Black Atlantic traditions or Afro-diasporic religions. In large part, those that are initiatory. So there is a phased rite of passage in order to become senior, in order to become considered an ordained person who is competent to transmit the tradition to future generations. Also, these are traditions of spirit possession, as Ahmad indicated, and also traditions of food offering. And so sometimes those imply sacrifice or life offerings, but many other times, and much more frequently, in fact, practitioners are giving fruit, vegetable dishes, grains to their different deities and ancestors. And so there are a number of syncretic religions that we can name. Revival Zion is such a fascinating case, and I myself am much less familiar with Anglophone or British colonial possessions and the traditions that came out of them. I focus my work on what is labeled here Santeria. Practitioners, though, refer to this tradition as Lukumi, Regla Ocha. Black American practitioners especially will sometimes say Ifa, that they practice Ifa or Orisha worship. But one of the things I like about this map is that it kind of shows how these traditions combine in different ways influences from the African continent. So you can see, Vodou here is labeled Vodou in Haiti and Voodoo in the Dominican Republic as having a heavy Daomean component, but we can also think about Congolese influences, Yoruba influences, influences from the Cross River region that here are named Ekpe. And so we can also add to this list, but at least it kind of gives us a starting point. Also, we might think about hoodoo in the American South, or conjure and root work. Those are kind of synonymous terms. Traditions that really look to West and Central African sources of inspiration, working with materiality, that they see embodiment in a way that's consistent with West and Central African precedents. Okay, and just the numbers, conservative estimate, 12.5 million people having been trafficked into the Americas, forced to work, having really no recourse or legal claim to personhood or social personhood. And so these traditions are traditions of survival that really allowed for the humanity, the creativity, and in part the imagination of enslaved people to live on into the present day. And we have these traditions now as a way of understanding histories that were not recorded, that were not considered to be able to be captured in archives. And so I'd love to kind of talk about that point a little bit further. But just in Cuba alone, I myself am Cuban. I study a tradition that emerges out of Cuba with Yoruba in particular, or Lukumi precedents. We have this kind of very wide range of different groups of individuals that gave rise to different Black Atlantic traditions. So Arara is one tradition that emerged in Cuba, standalone tradition. So it shares some of its personnel, some of its ancestors with Lukumi. They're all these different groups that added, whether it's language, added songs, added ideas of how to use colors according to chromatic theories that were developed in the pre-colonial African world. Caribali refers to a tradition that would become Abakwa in Cuba. Of course, we have Congo traditions, like Khytie mentioned, Ganga traditions of people who are from what is present-day Sierra Leone, and Lukumi, and on and on. So to study these traditions is really to try in some ways to reconstruct what is the legacy of these different peoples and to honor them. But also to recognize that Black Atlantic traditions crystallize in conditions of forced conversion and colonialism that also imposed a binary gender system on peoples and groups that did not conceptualize gender and sexuality in the same way. And so in some sense, they do preserve non-binary or kind of counter-binary understandings of gender and queerness, for example, the topic of today's discussion. But we also have to recognize the importance of different forms of Christianity. So this is my first book, Religion in the Kitchen. It pertains to today's conversation in the sense that what emerged from my study, thanks to my informants, was that the ability to recognize the importance of food preparation. So Khytie showed a table, for example, a beautiful table spread within the tradition that they study. This is kind of a similar, although very elaborate table that's set in the Dominican Republic for the 21 divisions, yet another tradition that I haven't named yet. Thanks to Ashabi Mosley and the person I call Tunde Mosley in my book, I was able, starting in 2001 or so, to begin a fairly immersive fieldwork project on the south side of Chicago, in a community that was predominantly Black and not Latino, Black American community of practitioners who are really committed to practicing Lukumi according to Cuban precedents, working with Latinx and Latino elders to, create a house that would really, hew to tradition. And that involved food preparation according to both sort of pre-colonial Yoruba precedents and Caribbean ones. And in the kitchen, I argue, very often we find gay men at the helm. We find cisgender women. Cisgender women are very prominent in worship in Lukumi traditionally, as not just leaders of communities, but as people who are sort of the masters of ceremonies for initiation, which is really an important role to play because they are the ones that direct everyone at one of the most sacred moments of the tradition, which is Cariocha, which is initiation. So food offerings are prepared according to sort of strict guidelines for each Orisha, depending on what they wish to have, what mythologies prescribe that they desire. And it was very curious that gay men are entrusted with having the expertise, the cleanliness, the organizational capacity to be able to direct the food preparation for a number of different spirits simultaneously. And I argue that within the space of the kitchen, that the talking that takes place, the small talk that goes on, really has the effect of bonding practitioners within the queer space of the kitchen. So it's a space led by either cisgender women for the most part, or gay men. And it's a space of joking, of storytelling, that makes practitioners into prospective priests, that really seasons them into the practice of Lukumi. And I think that there are ways we can maybe look at that model of subject formation and maybe apply it across Black Atlantic traditions. That's one of the arguments that I have in my book. And there are sections in which I kind of go on to analyze not just the visibility of gay men, but actually in some ways the erasure of lesbians. So I can go on to expand on, what that's about later in Q&A. But indeed, gay men, despite their prominence in the kitchen and elsewhere, they have not been accorded the same kind of respect. I would say that they deserve the kind of understanding of gay men's role in these traditions sometimes is limited to just a sense that they are able to receive possession by spirits more easily than straight men. And the kind of appreciation of them really stops there, where I would argue that they have a much greater role to play historically. So what I would like to pivot to then is to just thinking about the role of storytelling as a way to transmit narrative, because it's not just in divinations that people tell stories about the deities and their gender identity or presentation, but in really informal spaces, or as people will kind of explain songs that are sung in the kitchen and elsewhere. And it's a really amazing opportunity to learn more about the Orishas and in other traditions about other deities. One place where, if those who are interested in this topic are listening, they want to learn more, Queer and Creole Spiritual Traditions is one of the first books that really talked about the experience of LGBTQ people and the different spirits who they see as kind of being patrons for them in their queerness, in their creativity, in their nonconformity gender-wise. And so the title of the talk today refers to the spirit Ochumaré in the tradition of Brazilian candomblé, Nago Jeje. And so the serpent rainbow or rainbow serpent of Ochumaré is considered to be in some ways bigender, both male and female, sometimes male one time of the year, female at another time, and has emerged as kind of really emblematic of trans experience. And transgender practitioners sometimes point to Ochumaré to, sort of validate their experience within candomblé and other Afro-Atlantic traditions. Another book that might be of interest is Queering Black Atlantic Religions by Roberto Strongman, my colleague at UCSB, and we might be able to discuss his concept of transcorporeality at some point today. But I'll just end by saying that my interest is also in archives and kind of where archivally queerness emerges in the study of Black Atlantic religion. So this is a little tiny article from a periodical called Tao that I write about in my more recent work on transgender religious experience, and sort of this desire to claim for queerness, to claim for trans practitioners and gender nonconforming practitioners, even spirits that are considered quite binary, in this case, very masculine, Shango. And so I will end there, again, with many thanks and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that wonderful introductory comment. And Khytie as well. I think there's so much already on the table that you've offered us to consider. I wanted to begin by backtracking a little bit. I think you both alluded to this in your remarks, but I'm curious to hear from you about how the concepts of gender identity or sexual expression or gender performance, right, as conceived by feminists and queer theorists, how does that show up in your examinations of Black Atlantic religions? And on that note, and I think Khytie in particular, I heard this in your comment, but how exactly do practitioners challenge, right, or complicate feminists and queer theorists and their bold assertions about how gender and sexuality might work?
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for that, Ahmad. Yeah, so it's, just really a fascinating thing to think about. And it's also a complicated thing to think about, right? Because a lot of times the things that practitioners claim are also contradictory things, right? And so as scholars is also working through some of those kinds of contradictions. But one of the sort of foremost sort of, theorists on thinking about gender, sexuality, all of that, Judith Butler, when she talks about the idea of, the fact that, for example, being a man or being a woman, it's not an actual internal reality. It's not something that's just simply true. It's a phenomena. It's something that's produced, right? And I think in Revival Zion, that's something that I really see a lot, right? Because one of the things is that their understanding of the world in and of itself is really interesting, where for them, this reality is the carnal reality, right? And so they think of the world in terms of multiple kinds of dimensions that might exist you can move through at any point. So this is one of the reasons I focus on trans journeys and not so much spirit possession, because a lot of times, sometimes spirit possession tends to kind of talk about an ecstatic moment of something happening, whereas for me, the journeying is sort of a process that's always sort of ongoing with them. And so because if you're thinking about a world that is not stable, there's not even an essence to it in and of itself to begin with. Time, space, place are not sort of something you can always rest on stably. Then gender in and of itself is just not, if the world doesn't exist in that way, then gender in and of itself in a world that's always shifting and moving doesn't, it can't, you can't pin it down stably in that way. And I really also drop on the work of Nadia Ellis, who's a queer literary theorist and a Caribbeanist who talks about queer not as, an orientation or something that's about a category of who you are. But I like the way that they talk about it as, something that's shifting, and it can point to different places and spaces and moments and people, and different people, places, moments at a different time, right? And I think this kind of movement and journey with what it means to be even a human being inhabiting a body is something that comes up so often in revival, through trance, through these journeys, that really, I think they take that approach of gender expression is one kind of experience that you can have in the human form. And it's a way to exist and experience yourself. But there's multiple other ways of even experiencing yourself outside of gender and sexuality in and of itself, right? And so I think what I like to call their multiverse theory really allows for this kind of challenging of any kind of stability around gender and sexuality.
Thank you for that, Khytie. I'm going to transition a little bit, and Elizabeth, feel free to chime in on this next one. And I think it might be related, actually. You gestured here towards the end of your remarks in citing Roberto Strongman's notion of transcorporeality. I'm curious to know more about the body and embodiment, right? How do queer, transgender, and gender nonconforming practitioners engage matters of the body in these social, religious, political contexts that are shaped by slavery and colonialism and cis heteropatriarchy, right? How exactly does the body and embodiment become a canvas for queerness and queer religiosity, perhaps you might call it?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. So it's a vast question, but I mean, I think one of the things that we can consider, and Khytie to some extent has already spoken to this, is that there are so many different influences that everybody's destiny is considered to be unique. One's experience does not replicate that of anyone else's. And so it's quite, I would say, popular now on social media to sort of portray a deity, for example, like, classically Oshun, and to just describe her and her children as it's almost like a horoscope, that if you fit these if you do these things, if you like these things, then you're a child of Oshun. Well, the way practitioners actually see who they belong to has to do with ancestry, has to do with, how they were born, what Orishas wanted them to come into the world. And that might not be the Orisha that they are crowned to or initiated to. Then there's also I think the live presence of espiritismo. And so you have spirit guides that come into play. So maybe this person is very flirtatious because she has a spirit guide that is considered to be that way. These traditions that I've discussed, that I introduced at the beginning, most of them are not mutually exclusive. So you can be initiated in one of them and another at the same time. So I myself was initiated in Lukumi in 2016. I'm not initiated in Palo, but that is something that is a possibility. The late Mama Lola Alurd, she was obviously the Vodou priestess about whom Karen McCarthy Brown wrote, but she was also she had received initiations in Lukumi. So there is, however, a biological essentialism at play. And that has to do with the idea that one's embodiment in the world is as the Orishas would have wanted in Lukumi, or as major deities would have wanted. And so sexual orientation is actually a part of that, is part of embodiment. It's not considered to be sort of desire is not apart from the body. And there are divination verses, for example, in the Odus of the Merindin Lagoon divination system and Ifa that talk about, the emergence of queer subjects in the world. They have a place in the cosmology. Their desire has a place in, these divination systems that are quite normative. But that's where we get into, I think, the not just queer antagonism, but trans antagonism, or even transphobia, because the fluidity actually it's not a utopian possibility. It's a kind of more, what Jose Esteban Munoz would think about queer as being like a horizon, because there are limits that a lot of trans practitioners have found, because the tradition that I study and other traditions are quite binary. They deal with the movement of male and female energies, and they're not quite capacious enough to really as yet take in trans experience in its fullness, I would say, having spoken to transgender practitioners who really have come up against the limits of certain communities with regard to gender and sexuality.
I wanted to just add something to what Elizabeth just said. I think that's so fascinating, and something that I also think a lot about in my work as well. So for example, there's a lot of binaries that do operate. So for example, even the term twofold, right, is obviously positing two different things, but they use another term that I think is interesting in Revival Zion when they're talking about both people who are in 60 and 61, but also that fluidity. They'll say cross thread, right? And I actually like that term a little bit better because it kind of allows a little more space to not think about just twofold as either or, but to be cross thread, then you can't really disentangle those threads. But something that you also said in your part of the talk too, and people ask me about this a lot, is when you talk about lesbian erasure. And I really find that to be something that comes up a lot in Revival. So people ask me, you only talk about the men, and that's the only thing that you talk about. And so part of what I argue is that, well, there are queer women in Revival, but because of the way that Jamaican masculinity and heteropatriarchy work, the visibility for queer men who are operating outside of these gender norms is just, a lot more prominent. People talk about it a lot more. When I do interviews, or even if I'm not asking people questions about that, they volunteer that information about, pointing to these men and bringing these kinds of things up. And so that's something that I've been working on, is figuring out how to talk about sort of lesbians or queer women in this, kind of space. But also, even as I'm saying that as well, something that I do want to point out in my work is when I'm using queer, I specifically choose to use queer too, because I don't always ask people about their actual sexuality or sexual orientation, right? And so I don't often want to label them as things that they didn't say that they are. So I tend to use queer a lot more to talk about how other people see them, how they also see themselves, and the ways that they're moving in and out of what's normative, rather than me necessarily identifying that, this is the kind of partner you like, or this is the kind of thing that you like to do,
Oh, thank you for that, Khytie and Elizabeth. I'm actually curious, and we don't have to get into this here, but I wonder how much of the emphasis on gay or queer men might have to do with anti-sodomy laws, in particular, in these geographical contexts. And so maybe we can get to that later. But I think the points you raise are a perfect segue to thinking about, I read both of you as being queer theorists of religion, right? Or offering theories of queerness relative to the study of Black Atlantic religion in particular. And so I'm wondering if you could comment about your work in that regard. Like, what are the challenges of doing this work in the field of religious studies in particular? What kinds of stereotypes or ideologies make these sorts of projects challenging? And perhaps where do you want to see the field go in the aftermath of your projects?
A great question.
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I mean, I guess one of my challenges has been that, and I'm trying to say this in a way that in a way that's understandable, because it brings together a number of different things. So I was trained as an historian and an ethnographer. And so on the one hand, I feel my role as the researcher is to be I'm implicated, and now I'm heavily implicated because of my initiation. And I do have bonds of affinity and affection and affect with those with whom, sort of I continue to do field work. At the same time, I can see the critiques of the way that certain communities operate, but I'm not a theologian. And so one of my challenges is to try to, sometimes I say that I don't I don't write about what people should do. I write about what people do. And so, finding a way as a scholar to be critical, and yet to recognize that, number one, I'm not writing theology. I'm not, maybe if you squeeze the balloon in one direction, the air is going to go in another direction, and then you're still going to have a problem in terms of gender and sexuality, right? So, I mean, I'm very cautious of prescribing that these religions should develop in any particular direction. I feel like primarily my duty is just to write about what has been going on and what is going on, right? And yet, the critique emerges just from my interviews. The critique emerges from my delving into historical archives as to the silencing of certain kinds of people and bodies in these traditions. So that's one of my challenges.
Yeah, and to just pick up on that too, so I'll just name two of my challenges. I think one of the main challenges for me is even using the word queer. So I have a love-hate relationship with that term, but actually just for me, the way that I think about it is that I use it as a way to talk to the academy and not necessarily as a way to talk to practitioners, right? And I use it as sort of a shorthand, as a heuristic to be able to think through some of these, conversations and discussion within the field itself. But then when I actually work with practitioners, I find that that term may not always be useful, right? And then the other issue for me is, sort of looking at Carlos de Sena's idea about tacit subjectivities, right? In spaces and places where, in these sort of American, white, gay, liberal space, there's this idea of coming out and you declare it loudly and proudly and pride. And that's what queer is. And I'm like, but in all spaces it doesn't work like that, right? So how do you talk about queerness in places where people may not want to be explicit about it, where people talk in codes or people talk in ciphers about it? And how do you, have those conversations on one hand with folks and then also translate that in sort of the academy? So that's one of the challenges. And the second challenge for me is something that, Elizabeth actually brought up in her presentation when she said that she didn't know that much about sort of the Anglophone Caribbean. So that's one of my biggest challenges as well, is that I do think there are certain kinds of, tropes that get circulated about Black Atlantic traditions that tend to focus on, places that primarily had, either Spanish or French colonization, and so religions developed differently there under that. British colonialism was very, brutal in a different kind of way in terms of their systematic stamping out of certain kinds of, practices. And so I feel like I grapple a lot with that in the scholarship, is how to articulate places like Jamaica, religions like Revival Zion that don't necessarily have this sort of Yoruba model, or don't necessarily have a certain kind of model that, over time, and I guess that's the problem with, disciplines. Over time, you get disciplined in a certain kind of way, right? And so certain places become visible all the time, and then other places, are, less visible and more obscure because we get used to certain kinds of tropes. So that limits what we can see, what we're even looking for, the kinds of questions that we ask to begin with. And that's something that I'm hoping to challenge with some of my work, is for us to even think differently about, Black Atlantic spaces and how different kinds of colonialism develop different kinds of models in these different places, and how have we followed some of those tropes and sort of disregarded certain places because of it.
Thank you so much, Khytie and Elizabeth, for those incisive remarks. We're now going to turn towards Q&A. We already have some questions bubbling up here. And so one of them is from an anonymous person who writes, how do you think the African heritage of these religions help create a more fluid or non-binary understanding of gender? So anyone can feel free to take a stab at that one.
I can mention that, the importance of, I guess, mounting or possession here in this context, that, is a direct inheritance of, West and Central African traditions. And especially the sort of more Yoruba, Dahomean, Fan Eve model of the person who is possessed by spirit is mounted in the sense that somebody sort of would mount a horse, but also that it is kind of an erotic mounting. I don't want to say that it's sexual, because it's an experience that is one of the most sacred in these traditions. But nevertheless, the word in Yoruba, the word in all of the different vernaculars that talk about spirit possession, they have that pun, that double entendre, that it's a mounting by the spirit, it's a penetration of the body by the spirit. And that right there creates this kind of possibility that Roberto Strongman talks about of transcorporeality, which is to say that any human being can be penetrated or mounted by any spirit, by any of these deities that are the major deities in the tradition, and will take on their gender expression. And so, classically, a gay man takes on the sort of gender presentation of Oshun, a very flirtatious female spirit, or, so she is envisioned, although she has many paths, some of which are, an old crone who is, very, elderly and quiet. But nevertheless, there's the possibility of transformation there. There's kind of built into that model the idea that there's no essential reason that anybody should present gender-wise in a way that corresponds in some ways to their anatomy, right? However, there's also the understanding that cisgender men who are straight are actually quite resistant to possession, and that in fact, women who identify as lesbians or who have same-sex desire, that they are correspondingly sort of more masculine than cisgender women who are straight. And so you get this kind of interesting, for example, in Candomblé Nago or Ketu, the position of the Ekedi. And Andrea Stevenson Allen talks about how Ekedis are usually women assistants who kind of take care of people who are mounted in Candomblé by the Orishas. And they are seen to be able to do that because they are comparatively resistant to initiation. Very often they are lesbians in the community or women who have relationships with other women. So I see the African influence there being very strong. But by the same token, it can kind of help create a more fluid or non-binary understanding of gender, but how it actually plays out in practice might be a little bit different, because I don't think that it necessarily always leads to people reaffirming then the LGBTQ contribution to these traditions.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. We have another question from Anastasia, who wants to know, can you share how to find safe spaces for queer people to worship African religions, whether it be Santeria or Ifa? Sorry, excuse me.
It's not so easy, and I would say, often people come to these religions because of an interest in the music, the dance, the aesthetics. But traditionally, what tended to happen is that people would seek out a reading in these traditions because they had a situation that they needed help with, or something physical was happening, that they were ill, and they sought out the help of, in the case of leukemia, the Orishas. Now we have a kind of religious landscape where social media is so much at the fore, especially for young people. So at the same time, there's a lot of possibility there for networking. I know that there are communities of people who are LGBTQ who really loudly proclaim this, and it may be a majority gay and lesbian house, or maybe a very strongly trans-friendly house, or a house of worship that has a trans leader or leaders. But I think the only way to know if that's actually a safe space is to try to observe, to actually be there. There's no way to gauge that from a conversation, or especially, unfortunately, you have people sliding into DMs to, try to recruit members of communities, and they don't wind up being safe spaces. There's an issue not just of transphobia or queer antagonism homophobia, but of abuse, you know, you don't. So I mean, it's almost like I would say word of mouth is more important than, you know, whatever conversations you could have online, because it might not be a safe space.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really, really clarifying. There is a question for Khytie. Can you say more on cross-threading between the 60 and 61?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this is a term that, so basically in revival design, so you have 60, which is considered, so revival was formed in 1860, and 60 is considered the sort of foundation or the part of revival that's, you know, more mainline Christian. If you go, it looks more similar to what you would think Christianity looks like. And then 61, you know, ultimately was the next year, 1861, where basically, you know, African Jamaicans were like, this Christian stuff is cute, but we really want, or, you know, African stuff. You know, one of the things the practitioners often say is like, you know, we, you know, love Jesus, we worship Jesus, but the ancestors work faster. And so 61 really is kind of that area that will talk about that, right? And so the idea is that people who are in 60, and again, when I talk about the different dimensions of revival, there's an idea of depth and deeper work, right? And also the more African the practice is talking about going to deeper dimensions. And so the idea is that 60 is almost a little bit of a surface level kind of, you know, interaction and a surface level area of the spiritual realm. And then when you're in these trance journeys, which is called sometimes drilling the bands, when you go through this process and, you know, it's through this kind of percussive breathing that, you know, allows them to get into this kind of trance. You start with 60 and then you end up in 61. And then your leader has to also be able to bring you back from 61. Because when you go to the deeper depth, there's also a level of spiritual danger where you have to be able to know how to navigate the terrain. And sometimes you need people to bring you back, or you could get lost in that spiritual realm, right? And so that's the overall idea of what these nations and these two realms are. But to be cross, so usually some people will say, I'm purely 60, to mean like, you know, I'm not in the African part of it. I'm not in the deeper work. I'm 60. And then some people will be like, you know, well, I'm 61, right? And 61 is often the part that's demonized. It's often the part that is considered more queer and more African, and where you see that kind of Afrophobia and the homophobia really playing out against 61 practitioners. And then sometimes people use it sometimes as a pejorative to say, you know, he's cross-thread, which means that you're blending. It's not pure. You're doing two different things. You're doing both 60 and 61. But at the same time, there's also a spiritual power about being cross-thread, about having both of these two kinds of things together, about this sort of interweaving of both the 60 and 61 practices, where there's not a clear distinction, because part of it is if you are 60 and 61, then you're spiritually powerful because you can go to any realm. You could bring anyone back from any realm. And so cross-thread is a term that they use a lot of times. Sometimes it's used more pejoratively, but also it's used to really talk about this idea. And I mentioned before that sometimes people say twofold, but I like cross-thread a little bit more because I think it gets away from those binaries to talk about this kind of interweaving that's inseparable.
Thank you so much for that, Khytie and Elizabeth. We are at the end of our time together with this profound conversation. And I'm sure that we will have future conversations on Black Atlantic religions with LGBTQ RAN. Thank you all so much for joining. And I believe Mark Bauman will come up on stage, if I'm not mistaken, to close us out.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ahmad, Khytie, and Elizabeth, for this thoughtful and stimulated dialogue. You said so much, but like you just touched the surface. So I think you've invited us all to explore this whole realm, and we appreciate greatly your research and the groundbreaking work that you're doing. Also, thanks to all of you who watched and often your comments and questions. Within a few days, you're going to get an email with a link to a recording of today's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities like this to explore the history of queer religious movements, remember to check out the LGBTQ RAN website and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. Upcoming, here's a couple of teasers. Upcoming webinar topics include Gay Priest, John McNeil, Stories of a Passionate and Prophetic Witness, and Preserving Sistery, Archives and the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ is the first and foremost source of information on queer religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations will hear our voices and stories, please help make this happen with your gift. Finally, I remind you that if you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to one of the presenters, stay here and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. I close with one more thank you to Ahmad, Khytie, and Elizabeth for your awesome presentation. Good night, everyone.